What if Russia wanted to test NATO? Not with a full-scale invasion, but with something smaller, murkier and harder to respond to? That's a question that military planners have wrestled with for years, especially in the Baltic states. And it feels particularly timely this week after the European Union publicly accused Russia-linked actors of carrying out malicious cyber activities against governments and critical infrastructure across Europe, including in Germany and several other member states. Earlier this year, a public war game organised by WELT newspaper and the German Wargaming Centre explored what a future crisis on NATO's eastern flank might look like, and WELT has turned it into a podcast that I highly recommend. Let's listen to that trailer.
Are you saying that Russian troops are on Lithuanian soil?
Strictly speaking, it could justify an attack, but we shouldn't do them that favor.
Is this an Article 5 situation? And is this World War III?
Earlier this year, a war game simulating a Russian attack on NATO triggered an international debate.
Tonight, there is concerning news about NATO's reported weakness against a potential Russian invasion.
A high-level war game recently conducted by German publication WELT suggests Europe would struggle to respond.
And when it comes to the WELT exercise, we do not know all the specifics of the war game.
It was my colleagues and I at the German media outlet WELT who ran this war game. And it drew more attention than we had anticipated. This is Ernstfall. What if Russia attacks NATO? Inside a German war game. A podcast by WELT, supported by the German Wargaming Center of the Bundeswehr University Hamburg.
So today on Berlin Briefing, we're asking, what can war games tell us about the real world? How does Russia think about the Baltics? And are Europeans preparing for the right threats or simply projecting their own fears onto Moscow? I'm Nina Haase and this is Berlin Briefing. My guests are Carolina Drüten, International Security Correspondent at WELT, and may I say the brain and heart behind this podcast.
Thank you. I mean, I did that with dear colleagues together, but yeah, I did initiate the project and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're WELT's International Security Correspondent, and I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit about what happened behind the scenes, you know, how a war game actually worked. So really looking forward to your insights. And of course, we have Roman Goncharenko, DW's very own expert on all things Russia, to talk a bit about, you know, where do Western war games actually get the Kremlin right? Where do they not? And what does all of this mean for current decision-making processes? You know, where are some levers that the West have to deal with the situation in Ukraine? So, Carolina, let's start with the basics. Most people hear the word war game, and they think prediction. But what can and what can't a war game actually deliver?
It cannot predict, ironically. So I said this countless times, I think, in the podcast. We're not predicting the future here. We're exploring a possible future. So a war game, I like to describe it like a thought experiment. So you want to understand the thinking of your enemy, your own thinking, gaps in your thinking, and your own weaknesses. So you take a scenario. So in our case, we said Russia was conducting a military exercise on the Belarusian-Lithuanian border, and they did not withdraw their troops after that. That was a fictional scenario, right? And then...
But it's something that actually did happen very similarly in the situation with Ukraine, right?
Exactly, yeah, and that's why we...
Because they do conduct these military exercises every year.
We felt that might be something that Russia was actually prepared to do at some point in the future, potentially. And of course, I had a lot of background talks with experts on that from Russia, like Ukraine, Lithuania, Europe. So we had a lot of input. And then we took this scenario and we had experts and former political decision makers take decisions on the basis of this scenario. So we presented them with the scenario. We said, look, there's a crisis. You are now the German government and you are now the Russian government. play, right? And what it does is people take decisions and then the simulation develops. And as it develops, you can really find out patterns that I'm sure we'll talk about in this podcast as well.
Yeah, what I thought was fascinating was that you got some really high-ranking people to play roles that are not too far away from what they actually do in real life, right? I mean, you get people like, for example, NATO's former spokesperson to play NATO's Secretary General. So this is not your random Joe Miller. Sorry if there are any Joe Millers out there, but, you know, not them taking on the roles of chancellors.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we took former political decision makers or people who were in rooms where actual stuff was decided, like Oana Lungescu, who played our NATO Secretary General. She was there all the way during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? She was like always in the room when decisions were taken or like communicating those to the public. So she really knows what she's talking about. And we had, for example, Eberhard Zorn, who was the former General Inspector of the Bundeswehr, which is basically the army chief, right? We just use
Chief of Defense, yeah.
Chief of Defense. We just use a different word for it in German due to our history. And those people they were socialized in our political system and they knew stuff, right? And this is why we chose them, because we wanted the results that we got to be true to what the German political thinking looks like, right? And of course, we also wanted people who know what they're talking about.
And it did produce quite some headlines when it first came out in German earlier this year, because this is something that you conducted at the end of last year, and the results were then published and it got picked up by lots of international media, including NATO's real Secretary General, who said, okay, this exercise has actually produced some concerning results.
Yeah, and honestly, we were a bit surprised by the media coverage, but also Mark Rutte commenting on that. We did not expect that, really, because I felt that internationally it got picked up a lot more than in Germany, and that, I think, also speaks to our strategic culture, right? But I think that especially media outlets in the UK, in the US, were quite concerned about our results because in the war game, Russia... And I don't want to spoil the podcast for anyone here, but I mean, yeah, I gotta say it, right? Russia achieved its strategic objectives. So in the war game, there was a limited military incursion into Lithuania, and the German government was not in a position to take on a leadership role, which would have been needed to prevent this situation or react adequately. So people were quite alarmed, I would say, throughout Europe.
Yeah, because it's not a really far-fetched scenario. And it was one of the reasons why you decided to publish the podcast in English. The last episode comes out next week. So, everybody who's listening can tune in real time, basically, and follow your podcast. So I want to throw to Roman the question... a scenario where Russia doesn't withdraw troops after a military exercise. This is a really good starting point, right, for a war game. But why specifically? Can you tell us about that Suwalki gap? That is something that has become somewhat of a term that security circles really love speculating about, that narrow gap. Why is it so crucial? Why is that such an Achilles heel?
Well, it has to do with geography and with the Russian Kaliningrad exclave and the road there, which is about 60 kilometers long, I think. So it's not difficult from military point of view to try to cut it off and actually cut off the Baltic republics from the rest of NATO. And that is why it is considered to be a weakness in NATO eastern flank. But on the other hand, I think, because it is well known, I think the probability that Russia will attack there is relatively low. Because NATO is expecting something to happen there, has been preparing for such a scenario. I think if Russia would try to do something like that, I think they would choose a different place where maybe... so it's also... I don't believe it's Narva, for example, which is a small border town in Estonia. And there are a lot of scenarios, books written about it, how Russians would try to get hold of Narva and humiliate NATO. So a limited military operation. So the experts I've been talking to are expecting something at a different place. And what's interesting about this war game that you did a great job, I think, and you're the pioneer in Germany, because we had similar war games in other countries. I remember I was very impressed by the BBC production Inside the War Room, where they took the British government and tried to look how the politicians in Great Britain would react.
Sky News, the war game also.
Yes, exactly. What you did it on a brighter scale, so you also involved other countries, NATO, so not just one government. But for me, the most important thing was to show how weak Germany could be, because Germany is known to be weak because of its past, because of its difficult political situation, the German population, how Germany is trying to lead in NATO, especially with the new government under the Chancellor Friedrich Merz saying we are building the strongest conventional army in Europe. But on the other hand, the German army, the Bundeswehr, is still weak. It is still trying to catch up, and it takes time. And this is exactly the point where Russia might be tempted to do something.
But Roman, if you're sitting in Moscow, what is the strategy when it comes to the Baltics? How do you look at that region? Just, let's just put ourselves in the Kremlin's shoes. How do they look at that region? They are, those three countries, they are members of the European Union. They have NATO troops stationed there. So just to an international audience, perhaps not everybody is even familiar with these three countries that together, I looked that up, they have barely the population size of Ireland.
Well, the Baltic states were former Soviet republics, and of course there are still grievances in Russia about that. And the historic past plays a major role here. So for the Russian president, for parts of the Russian public, it is a target. So and there is Russian-speaking population there, especially in Latvia. And that is why they might see that as the leverage to do something on the border. And this is also part of such war games where, for example, the BBC series I've mentioned, Inside the War Room, World War III. So where they are trying to send soldiers with no signs, like they did in Crimea in 2014.
So Green Men.
Exactly, the Green Man, the so-called Green Man, trying to remain under the radar, that plausible deniability. Oh, everybody knows those
or the
are Russian
humanitarian
soldiers, yes.
mission.
Or exactly, or in your scenario,
scenario.
Exactly. So these are things that are important. So, for example, in Poland, it would be much more difficult because there is no Russian population there. Of course, there could be agents, spies, whatever, who might play a role. But in the Baltic states, it's different. And they're very close. They are small, as you've mentioned. There is one important thing here, and it's a recent development. Ukraine has been attacking Russia, deep inside Russia, targets like refineries, oil depots, and stuff like that in the north of Russia, St. Petersburg, which is very close to the Baltics. And Russia has been accusing the Baltic states of letting Ukrainian drones fly over to attack Russia. And there has been threats, and there has been a lot of talk on social media in Russia. Let's hit them there. So let's hit the Baltic states because they are helping Ukraine attack us. And this is, I think, is very serious. So there could be, as an excuse for Russia, so to say, an attempt to strike back. We have seen that Russian forces have diverted some of the drones to hit targets inside those Baltic states, for example, power plants. And this could be the way how things might develop in the coming months, because we do have a weakness at the moment, because the European governments are weakened, I would say. Look at Great Britain. There is a government reshuffle there. In France, coming presidential elections, important regional, local elections in Germany. So the intention of major Ukrainian Western partners, UK, France, Germany, might be inside drone. So that's why I think the coming year, or maybe the coming months, could be critical.
Okay, I want to talk about your war game a bit more, Carolina, because we've got you here. And it's so funny that you said that we don't really have that tradition when, fun fact, there's modern wargaming does have its roots in Germany, but in Prussia, right?
The Prussian Kriegsspiel, yeah.
But then that got lost also because of our history, of course, that it got very unpopular to even talk about war after World War II and the atrocities that the Nazis committed. So what did we lose in terms of, skills when it comes to how to think strategically?
I would say strategic foresight, looking at pure strategic interests of allies and adversaries, and basically imagining Germany in different positions. Like, we were briefly touching upon this before, that like Germany is building, or is like saying that it wants to build the strongest conventional army in Europe. Friedrich Merz talks about a leadership position that Germany wants to take, but the mindset is not there for that. It's simply not there, because Germany could always count on the United States to step up when we needed it to, right? So we outsourced our own security, and we lost that strategic thinking with it. And now that wargaming is coming back, I think it's an excellent thing. I mean, we got accused, not broadly, but like some people were saying, like, how can you play war? Like, that's sick, right? And I'm saying, well, I think you actually should, right? Because you don't want a war to happen. You want to know where your own weaknesses lie, and you want to know how potentially your adversary might think. So this is what it's important for. And I think people in Germany shouldn't be afraid to use this tool, right? And it's happening, I know it's happening inside the German government. NATO is doing that a lot, like playing through these kind of scenarios. And it really turns your attention to the blind spots. Like, what if Russia were to attack Lithuania in a limited military incursion, and the United States would say, like, look, we're not sure what happened there, right? We have to gather more intelligence. We're not supporting Article 5. You Europeans do what you got to do, but like, we're out, right?
And maybe we'll come in as mediators.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, we don't know what might happen, right? Donald Trump is good in giving out surprises, right? But it's a possibility, I think, based on what he said in the past. And then we might not be able to use the NATO regional defense plans in the way that they're drafted now, right? We don't know what the Americans would be prepared or not prepared to give. And I mean, even now, they're withdrawing key capabilities from the NATO force model, which is the basis for the regional defense plans. Long story short, it's unclear what the US role would be, right? And in that kind of situation, maybe there needs to be someone else in Europe who steps up and says, look, in order to not have Russia achieve its objectives, we would need to do X, Y, Z. And that is not something Germany is prepared to do, because Germany has always been focused in finding a solution that works for all allies, escalation management, working in line with other allies. So I'm not even blaming decision makers in Germany for that. It's just deeply historical rooted. But this is not the time for this kind of thinking.
When you say we've got to learn about how our adversaries think, this is something where I'm just putting myself into the shoes of somebody from the peace movement. There is a very strong, especially left-wing peace movement that still insists that Russia is not our adversary if we don't make Russia our adversary, and that, things could be resolved through stronger economic ties. There's, of course, also Russia-friendly political parties like the far-right AfD, who will argue, aren't you doing exactly with war games like these what you accuse Russia of doing, that this is part of propaganda against Russia.
And that's actually the way that was portrayed in Russian media as well, and Belarusian media. So interestingly, that's a point that has been picked up. I would say that, like, for Ukraine, this strategy of not seeing Russia as the enemy didn't work out very well, right? So before the invasion, I remember that there was a huge discussion that, like, why would Russia attack Ukraine? That doesn't make any sense. And it does not, from our perspective, but that's the point, right? We must not think from our own perspective. Like, we Germans are very good at, like, taking our own thought structures, let's say, values, like, assuming that what we think is what other nations, other countries, partners, adversaries think as well, right? And it's not the case. So in order to simulate the Russian way of thinking, because, I wouldn't want to do that, right? So we had a red team in the war game, and the president in the red team was Alexander Gabuyev. And he grew up in Moscow. He's a former journalist who worked in the Kremlin press corps, so he reported from there a lot. He knows the way that people who take decisions in Moscow think. And he's now heading the Russia-Eurasia Carnegie Center here in Berlin. Like, he had to go into exile.
And he won your war game, essentially, with the red team.
Yeah, he did, right? I don't really like to talk about, like, win or lose, because we didn't do this to say, like, oh, you guys lost, you guys won, but really to, it was a good exercise to know about structural weaknesses, right? So,
but where did they get it wrong, the blue team?
I think, first of all, in understanding what the Russians actually wanted. There's one part in the war game where Irina Mihalic, who played the interior minister in the blue team, she's a green politician from the German government. And it was quite late in the war game, and she was stopping her colleagues and saying, could anyone at this table assess what the Russians actually want? Like, what is their objective? And then Peter Tauber, the former general secretary of the CDU, who played the chancellor, was like, immediately, to make the Baltics Russian. And then Roderick Kiesewetter from the same party, who was also in the parliament, he was like, no, I think to demonstrate NATO's and EU's inability to act. And that was something that the blue team needed to have thought about in second one. Like, what is Russia trying to do? Because they were not trying to make the Baltics Russian. Like, in the red team, they were discussing, look, we want the security architecture in Europe to look more like before 1997, right? So no permanent NATO structures in the members that joined NATO after that. So including in the Baltic states, but for example, also in Romania. So their plan was to have a limited military incursion, pretend that it's a humanitarian mission, and then blur the narrative around it, sugarcoat it for the Americans to make sure that there is no strong NATO reaction, to then know this alliance is not doing what it is intending to do. That's all. So as soon as as the first Russian soldier, tank, whatever, like, moved across the border and NATO did not react, their objective was set. And then Peter Tauber, and that's the last thing I'm going to say about that. I was sitting on a panel with him after the war game, and he's like, when the war game finished, I thought we won. I thought the blue team has won. And I was like, oh, how did you come to that conclusion? And he was like, well, I thought that our objective, was to prevent a wider war in Europe. But that was not what Team Russia was trying to do. And also it was a problem that Team Blue, Team Germany never set an objective for themselves.
Not for themselves, and not thinking about what the objective of the other side was. So, Roman, how realistic is that? I mean, do Western governments constantly get that wrong? That Russia is all about trying to, conquer more land rather than achieving smaller, politically, strategically important objectives that are smaller?
Well, I think it is complicated, and I do believe that Russia would like to see NATO collapse because of inability to fulfill actually the commitments in Article 5. That is very important. And we have seen the testing. We have seen it in Poland in September 2025 when over 20 Russian drones flew to Poland. And
Article 5, I'm just thinking we do need to explain to people who are sort of beginning to get interested in security debates, is the article that basically says an attack on one
is an
NATO
attack on all.
is an
Exactly.
attack on all.
Yes. So there was a debate, I think a very heated debate inside NATO, how to react. They actually used for the first time F-35, I think, so to shoot down those drones, which is raises questions about how much money is being spent.
Because, of course, these fighter jets deployed against small drones.
Exactly.
It's just, the equation
so now
just makes
NATO
sense.
showed that it struggles to respond. It responded.
It was very proud that it responded.
Yes,
as well.
but on the other way, I think Poland expected a stronger reaction. And of course, NATO, I think, was hesitating how quickly can they respond, because they didn't know what happened. Were those drones really with the armed or unarmed? Because you would react in a different way in that case. No people were hurt, but we can imagine what would happen if that was the case. And then I think it was a shock for NATO, because they didn't expect it. And this is exactly how Russia is thinking. We will do something that you do not expect. So now NATO might expect that, might expect that on the, for example, also in Poland, where there is a hub for Ukraine at an airport where most weapons are being delivered to Ukraine through. And we have heard a lot of calls in Russia, let's hit that target, let's send drones there. And we can say after that the drones lost their way, that were diverted by Ukraine or whatever. So there is this very difficult situation for Western leaders. How do we react? How do we respond? Do we send drones to Russia or don't? And that's why I think it's very important to have such scenarios that you did in public, because every government is doing that, but the German public never really had an opportunity to imagine how actually things are running, how the government is struggling to make a decision. We've been listening with you together yesterday, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and he was praising that new cabinet that he is now having, the security cabinet in Germany, which is new.
National Security Council.
National Security Council, exactly. Something that other countries have had for decades. And for Germany, it's completely new. And it is very important to have such
We've actually done an episode on this National Security Council. We'll post the link.
Yeah. So I think it's very important to understand how the government runs, how the government reacts in a critical situation, to understand what could happen.
And Cara, what I thought was fascinating was how that situation that you just described, the conversation between the Chancellor and Irina Mihalic as Interior Minister, have we actually thought about what they want? That discussion happened while they were busy trying to figure out who was responsible for what in Germany and how to get hospitals to, free up beds potentially, and which laws needed to be changed. I mean, is that just something where they get lost and they can't see the forest because of all the trees?
I mean, to be fair, in a crisis like that, this is what Germany would need to be, NATO's logistical backbone, right? So Germany has been described as like the logistics hub of NATO. And the reason for that is like if Russia attacks the Baltic states and if Article 5 gets triggered and we have the regional defense plans, I mean, NATO now is like trying to really have a forward defense, like to stop an attack as it happens, but still you would need reinforcements, right? So you would need American soldiers, other soldiers to be brought to the Baltics, and Germany happens to be at the center, and troops would need to move through Germany in the hundreds of thousands.
We have borders with 9 countries.
Yeah. So there would be a lot of logistics. Like Deutsche Bahn would be needed, the ports would be needed, Bremerhaven would be absolutely crucial. And then if some like soldiers get wounded, for example, they would be, of course, treated there. But like if capacity is not enough, they would then be moved to Germany and treated here as well. So a lot of stuff would need to happen here. Water, energy, infrastructure, all of that, right? So Germany has the O-Plan Deutschland, the Germany operations plan, let's say. And in there, it's secret, so we don't know details, but we know that it sets out a plan for this kind of scenario. And in order to invoke certain measures and certain laws, it's quite difficult to achieve that, because the Spannungsfall would need to be invoked. This is like the state of tension, or even Verteidigungsfall. So state of tension can be invoked by Parliament, by the Bundestag, if Germany thinks that an attack is possible, imminent, right? So, and then in this kind of scenario, it's easier to invoke the emergency laws. So it's a state of emergency, basically, right? But you need a 2/3 majority in the Bundestag, and the mainstream political parties do not have that majority now. In our war game, it still got invoked, right? The adjudication or White Cell, the team that kind of like led the war game, the German Wargaming Center, took this decision. And that was a lot already for the blue team to achieve, right? So what they did was saying like, okay, we need, like in the Spannungsfall, in the state of tension, you can tell certain companies, you need to primarily produce for the Bundeswehr. We need Deutsche Bahn to transport primarily soldiers. And that's massively interrupting civilian life, right? This is why the threshold is so high, because this decision should not be taken lighthearted. But Germany was looking at the situation, the blue team, in our war game was looking at the situation, saying, we have a war in Europe, we have a security crisis. What's Germany's role in this scenario? We become the logistics hub. So we prepare our country for mostly American troops to move through. But American troops were not coming. So they were following the plans. I think Germans are very good at that, right? But they were not looking at the bigger picture, like what is Russia trying to achieve and what is our own options here?
And what are the Americans actually going to be doing, right? I mean, wasn't that the other key question? Apart from getting Russia wrong, they also had no idea what the American administration would decide to do, right? I mean, they were in contact with the actor who played the American
Secretary of State, Jeff Radke. Yeah, exactly. He's a former NATO and US diplomat, and I had long conversations with him even before the war game to anticipate how might a Trump administration present itself in such a scenario, because we don't know. And again, it would be wrong to assume that we predict any sort of reaction, right? We're not doing that. We're just asking, how would Europe, how would Germany react if Americans did not step up? And I think the necessity to ask this question is very obvious, right? I mean, at the NATO summit, Trump in the end was a bit more conciliatory than people had.
The real NATO summit just a couple of weeks ago.
The real NATO summit, But still, I mean, Greenland was put again on the table. The ceasefire in Iran was ended. Trump was heavily criticizing Spain, right? So you can just know what this administration is going to do. We had Jeff Radke in the war game, and he was saying the US was very hesitant to give a strong military reaction because in our war game, importantly, there was a ceasefire in Ukraine, because most experts say that this is the prerequisite for further military action of the Russian armed forces and government to do something outside Ukraine, because it frees up capacity, right?
It buys time as well.
It buys time. And we had a ceasefire in Ukraine in our war game. And then after that, there was the limited military incursion into Lithuania. And the Americans in our scenario were the brokers of the ceasefire. So the imagined American administration was saying, look, we thought we solved the security issue in Europe, and we're not prepared to have another scenario like that. So let's all calm down, wait and see. We don't think it's in Vladimir Putin's interest to have another war, right? that was what happened.
But if that is the assumption, then surely the blue team could have understood that the Americans had already decided to not be treated like a full-fledged NATO member in the sense of, oh, yes, there's a war in Europe, let's go send everybody in to deter Russia as much as possible.
There were mixed signals, as in real life, like the US president was saying one thing, the Secretary of State was saying another thing, then we have the Pentagon, so it was not clear how the Americans would react. But in such a scenario, it's just important to move very quickly, because if you don't, like if you don't act, someone will act for you, right? And that's also what happened in the war game. So I don't think that the German government was naive in thinking that the Americans would step up, but they still kind of expected it, or they weren't used to Americans not stepping up, right? And I think we also saw that when it came to military support of Ukraine, and Roman, you will know this better than I do, but that was a situation where Europeans really had to like sort themselves out and see, oh, what can we do without a strong American support? And we're still in the process of seeing that. I mean, now the Coalition of the Willing has announced that there will be military exercises in the fall, right? I don't think Germany will be part of that. What happens if in France we have a different government? And what if in the UK Burnham decides that he focuses more on the UK, right? What happens to the coalition of the government? What is Germany's position in that? Like, we have very real life examples for these kind of conversations that also happened in the war game. And I think what we learned is that we're not yet there to be fully prepared for such scenarios.
Just one point, if I may. You've just said that the prerequisite was a ceasefire in Ukraine. In all scenarios, this is the case. But I would caution to see it as a given. Because at the moment, as things are running for Russia, and they're running not good, it's not just a stalemate on the battlefield, but also Ukraine is attacking Russia more and more. So the Russian population is feeling those. War is coming back where it came from for the first time massively. And Vladimir Putin is under enormous pressure at the moment from inside Russia. So he has to do something. As long as the war against Ukraine continues, he might be tempted to attack, for example, a factory in Poland or in the Baltic states where, for example, drones for Ukraine are being assembled, or munition depots in these countries. Would this trigger Article 5? This is a scenario we need to talk about because it is, I think, more realistic at the moment as we speak. And the political situation in Europe, we've been talking about, and I've just mentioned it, and you as well. In Britain, there is this transition of government. In Germany, elections in September in Sachsen-Anhalt, where the far-right AfD could be the winner for the first time and could have its own government, which would weaken Germany, which would be, I hope it will not paralyze the federal government, but it will be a major blow for this government. And the United States, the midterms.
Why that is, you can find out if you watch the episodes that we have done on the far-right AfD, just to put that into perspective.
Yes, exactly. And the midterms in the US, something that you have in your scenario. Why the United States might be reluctant to respond. So in the coming months, we have a situation where it could be very dangerous in Europe what Russia could do.
And can I just ask you one thing on that? Because I find it very interesting that you say that like it might be a way out for Vladimir Putin to like attack, for example, a factory now that the war in Ukraine is not going in the way that he imagines, right? Why is that, like, from a Russian perspective, something that he might be prepared to do? Or, like, what kind of benefits would that give him?
It would be a crisis inside NATO, because NATO would struggle to have unity, I think. And I think the case with Poland was also because there was a lot of fear inside NATO that there will be no unity, how to respond. That's why the response was relatively low, I would say. And of course, it is also a signal for the population inside Russia. Look, we are doing something. We cannot prevent Ukraine from attacking, or we cannot protect, which is a major development, I would say. A few months ago, the former Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, said, no part of Russia can be safe, which is a huge thing to say. Mm-hmm. We've never heard anything like that, and we are seeing that this is happening. So against that background, there are queues for fuel at gas stations in Russia. People, so this dissatisfaction is growing, And Vladimir Putin has to do something to show that he's still on top, so to say. And that's why I think this is one of the relatively likely scenarios, that he will try to not just send a battalion over the border to Estonia or Poland. No, I don't think this will happen. But what he might do is an attack, a deliberate attack with drones or missiles, we don't know, on NATO territory. And that would be a major crisis.
Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about Russia. I'm just going to ask both of you to think if there's another gap in strategic thinking, what is it? What should Germany try and get more strategic foresight about? Which other areas around the globe? Because there are so many potential crises that are completely not on the radar, at least when it comes to the big public debate here, Carol.
Yeah. I mean, I think one obvious example would be the Arctic and the geopolitical changes that are happening there. Greenland, of course, as well, because in the Arctic, there's a lot of interest from major powers, like not only Russia and NATO or the US, but also China, for example. And in this question, NATO is really not aligned, right? I mean, we had the Greenland example. It seems to be back on the table. President Trump has mentioned it a couple of times. That would be one example. And there have been war games about that, but I think it's more timely now than ever. Or, for example, a two-theater scenario where we have a military escalation in Europe, but then also in the Asia Pacific, right? Because the US is shifting its attention to China, and that's not a new development, right? I mean, even Obama was saying, please, Europeans, can you please take on more of your own defense so we can focus on Asia, right? And Europeans just did not listen. So that's actually an effect that Donald Trump managed to have in the end, right? But if an escalation were to happen, for example, between China and Taiwan, if China were to maybe attack Taiwan or do a naval blockade, and then at the same time Russia escalated in Europe, that's something I think that we're not prepared for at all. So that could be something to look into. And then, of course, any potential conflict with Russia, I think, I'm not sure if the German government is asking themselves these kind of hard questions behind closed door, but in the NATO plans, like in NATO's defense plans, you would strike deep inside Russia, and Germany is trying to acquire these capabilities, right? But you wouldn't attack, of course, Russia, because it would be a defensive move. If you were attacked first, of course you would try to target the areas where these attacks come from, like military logistical points, military ammunition factories, these kind of things. But are we prepared to have this kind of debate in Germany? Because I think there would be massive backlash if something like that would happen.
It was the reason why Olaf Scholz, the previous German chancellor, refused to send those Taurus cruise missiles
exactly. I mean,
to Ukraine.
The debates we had around Ukraine, and Ukraine now, and also part of the reason they're successful now is they're doing a lot of things that European governments told them not to do, right? To attack inside Russia, to move into Russia. Would the German brigade in Lithuania, if there was an attack coming from Belarus, would they defend Lithuania until the border? If military necessary, would they move into Belarus? All these kind of questions, I think we're not asking ourselves, and they will become crucial if such a scenario would unfold.
And I'm just thinking about our American audience over here. They might be thinking, what if Cuba suddenly becomes another theatre as well? Roman, what do you think? What should wargaming strategists be focusing on?
I think they should, and you already did a very, very good job. They should involve more countries, because not just Germany, Poland or the Baltic states, but also Ukraine. I think Ukraine should be considered as part of such war games. Even if the war continues, Ukraine would intervene and help the Baltic states. I'm absolutely sure of that. Mm-hmm. So this is something that was probably missing in your podcast, but it's a factor. Speaking about other crises, this is very important maybe to make a game, and also for the German government, the multiple crises, like we've mentioned. The Asia-Pacific region, we now have the Strait of Hormuz, which is still not at peace, and we don't know how things might develop there. And any other region. So things could develop very fast in any other region of the world. Cuba, exactly. And this might also be a problem for the Europeans because the United States' attention would be drawn there. With the Iran situation still going on, the Middle East anyway not coming to peace. So multiple crises, this is something that could be a very big problem in the coming years until the NATO is strong enough, I would say, to deter, at least in Europe, possible Russian aggression. And we know that the plans they go until 2030. So the time is this window of opportunity for NATO to beef up, to be strong, also for the German Bundeswehr, is just a few years. So time is running out, as NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said here in Berlin in December.
Yeah, and what do you think, last question, in 5 years' time, what will we be wargaming?
I think Russia still might be a danger.
What about you, Carol?
I agree with that. And let me just touch upon your point. You said, like, we didn't have a Ukrainian position in our war game, and it's true. We also didn't have a Lithuanian position in our war game, and that caused backlash. And I understand why, because important point, actually, the Baltic states are saying, and I was there, right, speaking, for example, to the military chief of Lithuania, and they were like, we have agency, we will defend ourselves. And I have absolutely no doubt about that. I'm extremely impressed what's happening there in terms of resilience in societies. We don't have that level of resilience. What we were trying in our war game was to isolate the Germany factor, right? We isolated this factor to have a better look at it. So we were not saying Russia will attack, Lithuania will not be able to defend itself. No. If a scenario like that unfolded, how would Germany react? And I think this question, how would Germany react, is a question that will be important in Europe for the coming months and years. So I agree that Russia will still be a factor, but I think it's in our own interest to also look at what is happening in Asia, because that's the main American focus, right? And if Germany wants to keep NATO together to keep it transatlantic, I think there needs to be flexibility to see what American strategic interests are.
Well, thank you very much, Carolina Drüten, brain and heart and security correspondent for WELT publication. Thank you so much for all your insights and for coming to our little studio here. And thank you very much, Roman Goncharenko, Berlin correspondent for DW's Russian and Ukrainian service. And thank you very much to everybody out there. And I would so love to hear your comments about what you think will be wargaming in 5 years' time. So make sure that you drop us a line. Also, if you're still around, then you may be interested in hearing that we've won an award for this podcast. So you've come to the right place. You're part of the community. Thank you very much. We'll post the link in the description. We're very proud, and that gives us great motivation. We've also got a newsletter, as you may or may not know. So make sure that you sign up to that to hear more about Germany's perspective on all international debates, but also stories from Germany. And that's it for today. So thank you very much for joining. Till next time.